Welcome to our series of lessons on Christian counseling. Today we're going to look at basic principles of crisis counseling, Chapter 7. When we think of a crisis, we may think of a problem that has interrupted our lives for a brief period, and after some problem solving, it'll go away. The crisis counseling we are talking about today is really crisis intervention. A crisis of this level or magnitude can manifest a problem that has gone on for some time, and the crisis itself may be the tip of the iceberg. It may reflect a deeper problem that has not been dealt with or has been denied. The following information details crisis intervention. It can be a turning point in a person's life. It is also a subjective reaction to a stressful life experience, one so affecting the stability of the individual that the ability to cope or function may be seriously compromised. A crisis is not the situation itself, rather it is the person's perception of and response to the situation. It is the entering into the life situation of an individual or family to alleviate the impact of a crisis in order to help mobilize the resources of those directly affected. A person in a crisis perceives a precipitating event as being meaningful and threatening. He appears unable to modify or lessen the impact of the stress and experiences increased fear, tension, and confusion. They proceed rapidly to acute states of crisis, to a state of disequilibrium. Generally, crisis theory reveals a temporary upset accompanied by some confusion and disorganization and characterized by a person's inability to cope with a specific situation through the use of traditional problem-solving methods. It occurs episodically during the normal lifespan of a person. It's neither an illness nor a pathological experience, but reflects a realistic struggle in the individual's current life situation. There is a time span between precipitating event and the final resolution, and it varies from usually 4 to 6 weeks. Now we want to look at domestic violence. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and destruction of property make up domestic violence. An example might be the domestic violence law in Washington State, where it is against the law to hit, shove, push, pinch, grab, restrain, etc., and to an intimate partner. It also is not necessary for the partner to press charges. The state presses the charges. Many times a no-contact order is involved, and no contact means no contact, even through a third party. Also, anyone convicted of domestic violence must complete a 1-year state-approved counseling program. Many times in the church, women have been told to go back home and submit to the abusing partner. To those spiritual leaders and others who give that advice, I have some advice. Set the example. Demonstrate a Christ-likeness and take the beating for that woman. If you're not willing to do that, then do not suggest she go back to the abuser. General observations about the batterers say this, that they come in all shapes and forms, rich and poor, educated and uneducated, raised in the church and no relation to the church. Without intervention, 3 trends are common with the abuser. The cycle of abuse accelerates, the battering becomes more serious, and the abuser feels less and less remorse. He tends to be isolated. Drugs and alcohol are contributing factors in much domestic violence, but are not the cause of the abuse. The abuser attempts to maintain control by intimidation. He expects minimization and denial, and statements stating that she drove me to it. The abusers have rigid systems of belief regarding the role of women. Many times, victims of abuse are ambivalent and blame themselves. They lack the resources to leave the abusive situation. They do need a safe place to go if they choose to leave. They too often think they can change the abuser. Although they have an intuitive sense of the danger level, they misjudge the danger frequently. As counselors, we need to believe the victim and take him or her seriously. We might be the first person to actually believe him or her. We must not encourage marriage counseling in the abusive relationship because it puts the victim in more danger. It is the abuser's problem. Couple counseling is appropriate after all the safety issues are addressed. And as a counselor, remember, it is the victim's decision to stay or go. Be there to provide the emotional support needed for the victim to make a decision. The number one issue is the safety of the victim. Encourage the victim to have a safety plan, escape route, phone numbers, extra car keys, money, children's birth certificates, etc., all in an easily accessible location. The best modality for treating a batterer is group counseling. The minimum length of counseling should be 26 weekly sessions. The abuser's belief systems need to change, and this is the work of the counselor. We need to train children in the church and at home that battering is wrong, that the Bible does not condone it, and that the church will not tolerate it. Next, we want to look at depression and suicide. A depressed mood may be in itself a normal phenomenon, and after an experience of loss or an experience that hurts an individual's self-esteem, a sense of futility and lowered self-worth is to be expected. The depression that normally occurs is an attempt to overcome or repair the loss. In many cases, it is a coping mechanism a person engages in as an attempt to escape reality. People who are truly depressed have poor eating habits and do not get enough rest. They react to drugs many times, or perhaps the cause is drugs or other physical causes. They have a repressed anger, and anger turned inward. There is a reactive or grief depression that happens often. Negative thought patterns of faulty thinking are common among depressed people. A physiological abnormality creating a chemical imbalance could be the cause. Loss is one of the major themes underlying depression. Real or perceived loss is often the cause of depression. Loss becomes a trigger for depression. We have to get a rapport or develop a rapport as counselors with the counselees and do it in the form of simple questions. For instance, how long have you felt this way? When do you remember this starting? How frequently do you have episodes of depression? How long do the episodes last? When have you experienced this mood before? What pattern do you see in these episodes? What did you do to help yourself? What are the options you have to handle this? What is the worst thing you can imagine happening? What are you doing to make yourself depressed? What are you thinking about that is bringing on depression? Then there needs to be a reassurance towards your counselees, not shortcuts. Make every effort to keep the depressed person active. Ask, if you were not depressed, what would you do? Make specific plans of activity for the depressed. Then there needs to be a revelation. The depressed person is learning, and as they learn, help the depressed person look at all the sides of these new revelations. Then there needs to be a reorganization, a thorough understanding of what caused the depression, and the construction of the stronger self-concept. They need to keep up a daily routine. They need to get out of the house and go somewhere. To see family and friends often, but in small doses. They need to exercise daily. If it is difficult to talk, they need to write. They need to let people know that they need encouragement, not scolding. They need to remember that depression is usually does end. They need to keep up a good diet. Have someone they can complain to and express their anger. They need to work on their negative self-talk. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders states that at least 5 of the following symptoms have been present during the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. At least one of the symptoms is a depressed mood and the other a loss of interest or pleasure. First of all, a depressed mood, or it can be an irritable mood in children and adolescents most of the day or nearly every day. Another one is a markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. Another, a significant weight loss or weight gain when not dieting, more than 5% of body weight in a month, or a decrease or increase in appetite nearly every day. Also, insomnia or hypersomnia already nearly every day is another symptom to look at. Psychomotor agitation or retardation nearly every day. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt nearly every day. Diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness nearly every day. Recurrent thoughts of death, not just a fear of dying, recurrent suicide ideation without a specific plan, or a suicide attempt or a specific plan for committing suicide. The following are facts that must be considered in the diagnostic process. It cannot be established that an organic factor initiated and maintained the disturbance. The disturbance is not a normal reaction to the death of a loved one. These things must be considered. There are also warning signals as to what to do. Any previous suicide attempt is a warning signal. Take the person's threat seriously. Verbal suicide threats may be there. Be direct and talk to them openly. Moodiness or depression may be evident. Let the person know you care. They may be taking unnecessary risks. As a counselor, ask how the person is feeling and inquire whether he or she has a specific suicide plan. There may be a sudden tendency toward isolation. Make a suicide contract, an agreement with the person not to hurt himself or herself. They may be getting their affairs in order, such as giving away priceless possessions. We need to urge a person to get professional help when we see these signs. We also need to help them call their local crisis line and be made aware of the resources in their community that they can reach. There may be a loss of interest in work or school, a preoccupation with death or afterlife. They may formulate a suicide plan. There may be significant changes in sleeping or eating patterns. All of these are symptoms of depression, serious depression. Another subject we want to discuss is sexual abuse. An overview of sexual abuse tells us that 75% of all reported cases involve stepdaughter and stepfather, or stepfather and daughter, or father-daughter incest. Sexual abuse occurs most often between the ages of 7 to 12, but is common earlier. All victims are coerced and manipulated by the power imbalance, although most perpetrators do not use violence. 40% of all victims of sexual abuse require therapy in adulthood. The risk factors and preconditions of child sexual abuse are the presence of a stepfather. The perpetrators have always lived with the mother. They were not close to their mother. Their mother never finished high school. They had no physical affection from their father. The family income was usually under $15,000. And they had 2 or fewer friends in childhood. Now we'll look at the grooming process in the father-daughter incest. Number 1, a trust factor is developed between the daughter and the father. Then there is a favoritism of the father to the daughter. There is usually an alienation of the father and the mother. The grooming and seducing process is always done in secret. There are normal boundaries between the father and daughter that are violated in areas of bathing, dressing, bathroom behavior, conversations. The grooming phase results in stages of child sexual abuse. And these are the steps that normally involve grooming. The stages of child sexual abuse are engagement, the engagement process, which is access and opportunity in the relationship. Another one is sexual interaction, the phase which requires escalation of engagement. Then secrecy develops. Then disclosure and sexual intimacy develops. The summary of the grooming process cues are that the perpetrator will build a unique kind of trust, usually accompanied by favors. Then alienation of the victim from family members and peers. Then demands of secrecy upon the victim, and boundary violations. The presence of 5 or more of the following reflects sexual addiction. Sexual obsession and fantasy is a primary coping strategy. Sexual behavior is the central organizing principle of daily life. Inordinate amounts of time spent in obtaining sex, being sexual, or recovering from sexual experience. The amount or duration of sexual behavior often exceeds what the person intended. A severe mood shift around sexual acting out is present. The escalating pattern of increasing amounts of sexual experience because of the current level of activity is no longer sufficient, exemplified by more of the current sexual behavior or addition of new sexual behavior or initiation of new high-risk illicit and immoral behavior. The persistent pursuit of self-destructive or high-risk sexual behavior. the persistent desire or efforts to limit sexual behavior, the inability to stop behavior despite adverse consequences, the pattern of out-of-control, compulsive sexual activity for 2 years, the pattern of alternating excessive control and out-of-control behavior for 5 years, severe consequences due to sexual behavior, presence of clear hierarchy of sexual acting out behavior, important social, occupational, or recreational activities sacrificed or reduced because of sexual behavior. Also in our diagnosis, we must consider the presence of any 3 of the following associated conditions: extreme sexual shame, other addictions, has he been or is he currently a victim of sexual abuse? Does he lead a secret or a double life due to sexual behavior? Is he sexualizing nurturing relationships? Are there few or no non-sexual relationships in his life? Does he get involved in suicidal ideation or an attempt at suicide? Is there the presence of sex-negative behavior in his life? Does he reveal excessive reliance on denying and denial associations? Is there the presence of a codependent personality in his life? Next, we want to look at the subject of dealing with grief. There are 3 areas in particular we're concerned about. One is the death of a child, which means the loss of the future, or the death of a spouse, which means the loss of the present, or the death of a parent, which means the loss of the past. The signs of unresolved grief are when a person refuses to talk about the deceased, when on anniversaries and birthdays they experience depression, when they constantly compare new relationships with old, when they experience morbid grief. An example would be keeping ashes of loved ones, or when there is excessive grave visitation or never visiting. The nature of grief can be seen in the fact that no one can get through life without loss and grief, and so we all face it from time to time. Grief is a God-given, natural, healthy, self-corrective process whereby an individual can separate from someone or something that has been lost. It is healthier to express emotions than to repress them. Repression is the means by which intolerable memories are kept out of the consciousness of an individual. Anger is a common response to loss. Guilt is a normal and common reaction as well. No one succeeds at being good and loving all the time. Usually there is a sense of unfinished business. Pain must be faced before it can be healed. The grieving person will live and relive memories, and only gradual confronting each one with the realization that no longer does this life correspond with something real will they begin to heal. The whole sequence is repeated by them over and over. The specific psychological task of the counselor is to break the emotional tie one has with the deceased so he or she can reinvest attachment and emotional energy in living people. Time does not necessarily heal all wounds. There is no time limit to grief. He or she can get stuck in one of the stages of grief for a long period of time. The following is a list of do's and don'ts in responding to the grief of an individual. Acknowledge the loss with a card or a call or a letter. Number 2, simply say I'm sorry or words fail me. Number 3, words aren't always necessary. Hugs, tears, etc. also convey sympathy. Number 4, give the mourner permission to grieve. Number 5, listen without being judgmental. Number 6, allow the person to talk about the deceased loved one. Number 7, ask open-ended questions. Number 8, offer practical advice and to pray with them. Number 9, share a pleasant memory or words of admiration for the deceased. Number 10, remember them on the painful holidays, especially the firsts. Number 11, remember that grief is long-lasting. Number 12, remember that usually the most difficult time is 7 to 9 months later. And number 13, remember that nothing you say or can say will stop the person's pain. Of the don'ts, number 1, don't say, don't cry, or be brave. This may cause repression. Don't use cliches like time heals all wounds or the Lord knows best. Don't be afraid of tears. Number 4, don't say, I know how you feel. Number 5, don't make statements or ask questions that induce guilt or affix blame. Number 6, don't change the subject when the person talks about his or her loved one. Number 7, don't tell the grieving person his or her loss is God's will. Number 8, don't try to answer the question, why? Number 9, don't attempt to minimize the loss because others are still in the family unit. Number 10, don't encourage the person to get over it because of your discomfort. The Harvard School of Psychiatry conducted a study with 150 widows about who was the most helpful person in dealing with the death of a loved one. The first they listed was the funeral director, second, nurses, third, clergy, and fourth, physicians. Grief is not the result of what happened to the deceased, but what happened to the bereaved person. Loss of self happens when someone significant dies. Example, when the wife dies, loss of meaning in life as a husband. The core of grief is anxiety. It is the form of separation anxiety. Resolving grief is learning to live with the memories, both positive and negative, and to restore meaning to life. We now look at the subject of chemical addiction. Chemical addiction is a primary, progressive, complex addiction of psychophysiological characteristics with them identified by dependence on substance or substances and resulting in habitual, compulsive use without regard of life's consequences. The early stage of alcoholism consists of blackouts, gulping drinks, sneaking drinking, repeated attempts at abstinence, increasing tolerance, drinking before drinking functions, preoccupation with alcohol, uncomfortable in non-alcoholic situations, irritation in discussing drinking, frequent reference to alcohol in normal conversation. The mid category is changing beverage of choice, loss of interest in activities not related to drink, job loss or frequent job changes, projection, denial, alibis, neglect of food, loss of control, protects the supply, avoids family and friends, inappropriately plans larger life changes. The final stage includes tremors, early morning drinks, physical deterioration, onset of lengthy intoxication, moral deterioration, impaired thinking, drinking with inferiors, unable to initiate action, indefinable fears. All alibis are exhausted. We now look at some observations on helping the chemically dependent. Number 1, when observing a major change in the personality of someone, always screen for drugs and alcohol first. Number 2, remember the rules of an alcoholic home. Don't talk, don't feel, and don't trust. Also, the premier defense mechanism is denial in an alcoholic home. This fortress has to be assaulted at the belief system. The inconsistencies must be confronted. Another one is to expect grandiose thinking from the alcoholic. Another is to expect all or nothing thinking from the alcoholic. And do not be surprised at long periods of sobriety. That does not indicate a cure. In recovery, expect relapses, but do not give up helping. Chemical addiction stunts personality growth. We need to ascertain when the person first started using, because that is where the person is in maturity and coping skills. As counselors, remember that the whole family needs help. As the addicted person begins recovery, do not neglect to see that all family members receive help. Codependency is the nature of this family. The family system needs help as well as the substance abuser. And finally, in looking at the essence of crisis intervention, a counselor needs to realize that a crisis counselor is not required to be a professional, only to be equipped, trained, compassionate, and involved in people's lives. In conclusion, Let us remember that a crisis counselor is not required to be a professional, only to be equipped, trained, compassionate, and involved in people's lives. The essence of crisis intervention is the counselor's concern for the spiritual and emotional welfare of people. The crisis counselor must be willing to sacrifice time and perhaps money or whatever to make sure people are comforted through counseling and are able to understand what is happening to them and who they need to turn to for divine help. It is not an easy task, but one that can be greatly rewarding and requires of us as Christians the willingness to love our neighbors as ourselves.